Hi, good evening, everybody. Hi. Right. My name's John Cater, and I have the privilege of being the Vice Chancellor of this university. And it's a delight to welcome, I think, almost 300 of you here, on what's a fairly bleak, evening out there. It's a real pleasure for the university, and also actually a personal pleasure for myself as well, because over 30 years ago, Stuart and I started at this university in the very same month. There was a difference. In my case, it was my very first permanent lecturing post, and Stuart, who never hesitates to remind me, of course, therefore is younger than I, because Stuart actually came here from the delights of Wigan Casino and King Street on a Saturday night in Wigan. And he came here with the express mission, I think, with his sound system to destroy the walls of Lancs Hall. And subsequent to him leaving, we actually had to demolish it, I think. People said it was concrete cancer, but I think actually it was probably the vibration. Now, many of you, if you've read some of the early books, and I have to say, this is simply to avoid me having to pay to buy any more this evening. I've actually got, I fished my set out at home earlier, and you'll know of Stuart's background. If you go back actually to the very first book, or in this particular series, Sided with Roadies, you'll actually, I guess, read about the music of the 1970s and 1980s. It's about the time which actually punk, I think, was really sort of emerging, wasn't it? Around the time, yeah, we both started. He knows better than I do, you see. Okay, about the time we both started here. There's a history of actually Stuart working at Somme College. How he actually came to, almost by chance, be taken up by NME, and how that job evolved and developed, the work in radio, and more recently, the work in television as well. And from my side, I mean, I found, obviously I worked my way through sort of Pies and Prejudice, which for someone who came from, the southern part of the Midlands, gave me, I think, some insight into the community I've spent the last 30 years in. And also, 2 years ago, it was fascinating to see Stuart, go back and actually write about the places where I was born and brought up. Adventures on the high teas, and I think actually managing to capture the nature of that society. About, is it now 2 years ago you received an honorary degree? I can't remember. It was slightly less, wasn't it? I think. Yeah. Getting on for 2 years. Yeah, so we're coming up for 2 years ago, and at that time I remember talking with Stuart over lunch. I mean, Stuart is actually the only person who, in his current book, manages to get a reference to Tanya Byron and to lamb chops in the same sentence, which, and I remember talking, Stuart was talking about the nature of the book that he was working on, and I thought the concept was absolutely fascinating, taking a day from each decade of the 20th century and looking how that day had an influence on society for the years which followed on from that, and how those key days, and I won't work my way through them because otherwise I'll have done someone else's job for him this evening, but picking that key day, that key event, and looking how it influenced the economy, but almost perhaps more than anything else, how it influenced society, how it influenced perceptions, how it influenced lives, over the years and actually subsequent to that. I think it was a fascinating concept. I have to say, I pre-ordered the book. The book is even better than the concept, in my view. I think it's an absolutely fascinating piece of social history, and I've seen. If you look at the cover notes, I mean, you see sort of Stuart described as, I always thought it was rather, dangerous to describe, someone from Wigan as actually wiser than George Orwell. I'm not sure that's a compliment in Wigan. I think to be described, I think, as sort of an English Bill Bryson. I've read Bill Bryson's book on Shakespeare. It is boring. I have to say, I think my personal view is that everything that's sort of Stuart has written, I think, actually has a relevance and a poignancy perhaps for us, which perhaps a lot of some other authors' writings doesn't have, and also described most recently, I think, as by some as actually a young Alan Bennett. And I think if that's a young Alan Bennett, then perhaps this the latest book in some ways is, I guess, Stuart's History Boys, I guess. So absolute privilege for the university, delighted to welcome a friend, a graduate, and an honorary graduate of Edge Hill, Stuart Maconie.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, John. That's very sweet of you. That's a very flattering introduction. I have arrived, as some of you may have just seen. Oh, look, I can dress myself. I'll dress. This is called dressing, if you're on the telly. I'll dress this microphone cable. I know we're not on the telly, but you know, standards have to be maintained. I'll tuck that away. Right, I'm going to let you into a little secret. In the grand tradition of all the time I was here as a student, I've managed to arrive in this lecture hall late. Thank you for bearing with me. No fault of the good people at Edge Hill, of Mary, who brought me here, but I was on air in Manchester till 4 o'clock, and then got a train, and we've been various things. And then I decided to hang. Seasoned travellers will know the technique, told to me by Mick Jones of The Clash, he name-dropped, of hanging your shirt in the shower of a hotel to make all the creases fall out, which works well enough as long as you don't then drop the shirt into the shower. So, a little damp, but I'm here. Thank you for coming along, and thank you for John for that lovely introduction, which was very flattering and very touching. And yes, I'm going to talk about the new book, newish book, because, not just in a kind of mercenary way to flog a few copies, but because it's got 10 chapters about 10 days and 10 related subjects, from football to strikes to the role of women to television to mountaineering. It just gives me a chance over the next hour-ish, a bit less than an hour, and then you can ask me some questions if you like, about anything you like, because I'm aware that some people like the books and hate the radio, and some people like the radio shows and have never read the books, so feel free to ask me about anything you want. But yeah, it just gives me a chance to riff on some interesting subjects, I think. So it's not just a formulaic plot through the book, I hope, but we'll see. We'll see. You can be the judge of that, can't you? Yes, so I'm now getting myself in gear. I see I have... I don't even pretend. I've just been poured a glass of wine upstairs, and I see there's another one here. I could pretend. but hawk-eyed continuity-style people would think, hang on, he nearly finished that one. But I promise you, this is just because I have had quite a long day and we've had pretty trouble getting here. To tell you the truth, that leads me on to something I was going to say. When you're on the book kind of tour circuit, you often end up doing events either just before or just after other people who've got books out at the same time. So you're quite often in bookshops and in theatres and in halls like this, and people will say, oh, we had that such a body. We had that Beryl Bainbridge here last week or whatever. Obviously not now, that was rather a poor choice, but sorry. Roy Hattersley. No news? Good. And in my case, I sometimes get people who are on the same sort of stable, if you like, of books, Random House Hebrew Books as me, this time around Dave Gorman, Danny Wallace, and Gok Wan. He was a lovely man, and we kind of overlapped at a gig recently, and I said to him, Gok, some ladies of my acquaintance are big fans of your television shows. As far as I'm concerned, I want you to write a book called How to Look Good Knackered. Because frankly, that would be more use for me. So, okay. So when I was a student here, and later when I was taught the young people of Skelmersdale at the People's Republic of Skelmersdale at the People's University there, I would talk often about the news. Fashionable in sociology then was the notion of people being critical of the news, because it would say that the news presented history and events as if they were all comprised of exciting, beheadings, revolutions, strikes, things like this. Whereas in fact, as the good staff here would tell me, and I in my turn passed on to a younger generation, news, as the Glasgow Media Group would tell you, was about slow economic forces out of our control that moved like a supertanker. And there was nothing sexy or interesting really about it. It was about economics and science and politics and stuff like that. And then what do? I go and write a book that is all about 10 sexy and newsworthy days. So with apology to all the sociology staff here, if any of them are still here from my day, and to the people at SCEM, the young people at SCEM, who I passed on that to, sometimes single events do crystallise or sum up or even engender changes in our society. And that's what Hope and Glory is about, if you've not read it. If you've not read it, still some copies available. Yeah, so hope and glory. So news, and also rolling news is one of my bugbears. I talk about this in the book. When I was a kid, when I was eating my Findus crispy pancakes in front of Rent-A-Ghost, and it said, newsflash, and Sandy Gall would say, we now go to the studios of ITN for a newsflash, there was a sharp intake of breath all around the room because this meant the assassination of a president, a landing on some far-off heavenly body, something like that. You watch Sky News or BBC News 24 now, rolling news, breaking news. Have you seen that little thing across on breaking news, which seems to be every day? Man in suit criticises other man in suit. Public schoolboy, no, I won't get on that soapbox quite so early in the evening. You know what I mean, though? The leader of the Labour Party has criticised the leader of the Conservative Party. No, Sherlock. That is not breaking news as far as I'm concerned. I want to go back to those old days. And so these are those kind of days, I'd like to think anyway. I'd just like to stress that these are British days. An American friend recently said to me, you should stress that they're British days. And I thought, you're right, because not even I, some people would say a little Englander, although I hope not in the worst sense of the word, would say that the 1966 World Cup final was more important than the assassination of JFK or the landings on the moon. But neither of those two things are in, because these are days significantly about Britain. So the first day in the book is, it's not so small-minded, by the way, that one of the days is the tearing off of those Velcro skirts by Bucks Fizz at the 1981 Eurovision. It's not that small-minded. It is, you know, reasonably grave and sombre and serious. In fact, the first 3 chapters are very grave and sombre and serious in some ways. I've tried to shoehorn some joke. Sorry, I've tried to weave skillfully some jokes into the narrative, but by sheer definition of what the subjects are, the first 3 chapters are probably the most serious in the book. So let's get them over quickly, shall we? The death of Queen Victoria. Queen Victoria, because she had the misfortune to come to prominence in the early days of photography, where you had to stand still for 25 minutes to get anything like a likeness. Her public image, the image that's come down to us, is a rather dour, cuboid little matriarch, when in fact she was apparently quite a feisty kid in her teens, in her youth. Feisty enough, certainly, to grapple her way to the throne against the express wishes of her mother and her mother's advisor, who had her kind of under some kind of house arrest called the Kensington system, which you can read all about in the book. But basically, she was a bit of a street fighter in some ways, who got herself to the throne by sheer force of will and personality, and also by the very clever experience of getting herself a husband quite early on. And as you may know, she married a gentleman called Albert. Now, if you go to Osborne House in the Isle of Wight, which was their kind of Italianate southern bolt hole, she was very, 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 she was not keen at all on her subjects, Victoria. That's fair to say. She really thought, who are these oiks and why do they keep bothering me? So she loved going to the Isle of Wight, to Osborne House, with Albert. And if you go to, not as much Liverpool and around here, but Manchester, she used to, and some people around here I'd say would probably say this is very wise of her, she used to pull the curtain of her carriage down when her train went through Manchester. She did indeed, because of its leftist leanings and its ugliness and its suffragettes, of whom more in a moment. Where was I? Osborne House. If you look at the portraits there, you will see straight away that Albert is, in the euphemistic words of the people who write profiles in the Radio Times about character actors, not conventionally attractive. He looked rather like a horse and had what I describe as a revolutionary toilet lid hairstyle, the world's first comb forward. Queen Victoria, though, was not of this opinion. She thought, to use expressions that I'm sure you young people use all the time, she thought he was buff, well-fit and jiggy. So she married him. Reader, she married him. And she liked to hang out there in the Isle of Wight with him. When he died, which he did rather early, of course, as you may well know, she took it badly. Saying she took it badly, who does that remind me of? Saying she took it badly is something of an understatement. She refused to appear in public for 2 years, and when she did finally appear in public, she's the Queen, remember? Sort of goes with the job, appearing in public. She refused to appear in public for 2 years. When she did, she appeared in public only to unveil a statue of Albert. She dressed in black for the rest of her life, and She had his shaving water brought to the bedroom every morning, his hot shaving water by a valet, even though he was dead. One of the things I like to do in my books is kind of slightly, even though I'm no expert historian, but then again, it's neither David Starkin, it's not stopping him, is trying just slightly challenge kind of bits of perceived wisdom and kind of urban myth that go down through the years. One of which being that Queen Victoria was an adored matriarch who everyone in the country was well behind, and that whose public mourning was some kind of national treasure, if you like. It was for about a year, and then people started to think it was weird and creepy. In fact, the Times of London itself, the old thunderer, said in a leader article, basically, pull yourself together, ma'am, this is beginning to look weird and creepy. And she was very angry with them because of it. On that tack, there were 8 assassination attempts on Queen Victoria's life. Did you know that? 8 assassination attempts on her life. Admittedly, they were probably the 8 most mental and incompetent assassination attempts ever in the history of politics, the most so being by a Mr. Bean. Seriously. Seriously, Mr. Bean tried to kill Queen Victoria, but he loaded his gun with paper and tobacco. Now, chief amongst those probably at the time, because Queen Victoria was no sister, she was disliked by the suffragettes. The feeling was mutual. She thought the suffragettes should be horsewhipped. That's actually one of her quotes. She felt they should be horsewhipped, that they're a disgrace to their sex. And again, popular opinion, perceived wisdom, because of Mary Poppins, chiefly, I grew up thinking the suffragettes were kind of ladies in crinoline, nice ladies with placards that basically said, please, Mr. Asquith, if it's not too much trouble, could we have the vote sometime? This was not what the suffragettes were like at all. The suffragettes were effectively terrorists. They wouldn't have managed to succeed if they hadn't been. They were full-on political agitators who said, Emmeline Pankhurst said, the most forceful argument in politics is that of the broken window. They did a lot more than break windows. They blew up Lloyd George's, they blew up Lloyd George's holiday home. They blew up Lord Lever's holiday home at Rivington Pike. They attacked Asquith and his cabinet on the golf course. They tried to burn down the Wimbledon All England Tennis Club. They tried to burn down Newcastle United's ground. They tried to burn down Aintree Racecourse. They tried to burn down Preston North End's football ground, which as a Wigan Athletic supporter I entirely approve of. They often went for sport. They often went for the male-dominated enclave of sport. Most famously, of course, when Emily Davison, stood in front of the King's Horse at the I've forgotten what year it is, the Derby of 1904. She did have in her pocket, by the way, a return ticket by the train, seriously, and a ticket for a suffragette dance that evening, which, of course, leads us to believe she did not intend to kill herself, but kill herself she did. And if you look at any of the old Pathé newsreel footage, although it wouldn't probably be Pathé then, would it, of her funeral, what it will remind you mostly of is an IRA funeral. Gun salutes, black armbands, that kind of thing. Reminding us once again that these were not quite the delicate flowers that modern history has painted them. And again, I'd say, they would not have succeeded if they had been. They got what they wanted. They got the vote. They got the vote probably quite a lot due to the advantageous intercession of the First World War, but they got the vote, and that's pretty cool, really, when we consider that the good women of Switzerland didn't get the vote till 1971. Which is extraordinary, isn't it, really? But before we clap ourselves too much on the back, we are still 48th in the list of countries in the world with the most women MPs. There are 47 countries with more female MPs than us, 2 of them being Rwanda and Iran. And certainly when you look at our modern political system, which I'll probably return to later, and you see that far from becoming more diverse and meritocratic and multiracial, multigenderal, if there's such a word, you see that in fact it seems to be becoming drawn from an ever narrower strand of the population. That's my soapbox again. I shall hop off that lightly. And the First World War then, the coming of the First World War had a lot to do with the acquisition of the vote. That's the second chapter in the book, the Battle of the Somme. Another thigh slapper, eh? Don't worry, we'll crack through. The Battle of the Somme, I put in because it gives me a chance to talk about the English and war, and because the Battle of the Somme casts such a massive shadow over British culture. Still to this day, some would say. I got into a lot of trouble in Accrington. I went to Accrington because if you know the story of the Accrington Powells, Accrington lost pretty much a generation of its young men in an afternoon. And people say that Accrington's never recovered from that, that a pallor is still cast over the town. They had black on the buses till the 1980s. They still wore a strip of black in the livery of the buses till the 1980s to commemorate that. And still, you know, hundreds of people will turn out in Accrington for a commemorative service. I went there to talk about that, and I got into a lot of trouble with the Civic Chamber of Commerce in Accrington, who basically accused me of not saying enough to encourage people to come for a mini break. As my reason for, you know, they actually said things, gratifyingly, they actually said things like, I see you didn't talk about the cost of coffee. I had come to write about the Battle of the Somme. Sorry that I couldn't have found more promotional opportunities. Gratifyingly, when North West Tonight went out to do a vox pop out about this, because bless them, papers have got filled, I know more than most, you got filled papers and telly and radio with something. But when they went and vox popped people on the streets of Accrington to ask what they felt about this slur on their town, because I basically said, it's a bit miserable. They all said, well, he's absolutely right, what's the fuss about? England and war, it's kind of what we do. Fighting is as English as farming. It's an industry as traditional as forge or field or foundry. War is a product as solidly, dependably English as Wensleydale or Worsted or Wedgwood. Our other traditional industries might have shriveled to nothing through neglect or contempt, mining, steel or textiles, say, but warcraft remains. It prospers even. The last couple of decades have been boom years. Look back into your family. You might not find policemen, you might not find firemen, you'll find soldiers. My dad was one briefly in Kenya. Your dad or your granddad or your big brother or your uncle or someone will be there too. In your family albums, you will find pictures of one of your male relatives in khakis and fatigues, in big shorts and a daft hat, in Cyprus or Hong Kong or Aden. Conscription in time of war and national services mean that it's an experience known very well to us. In fact, our novels, our dramas, our songs and our sitcoms often deal with it, imbued with that curiously British mix of pride, of humour, of skivery, of boredom and of fear. I've never square-bashed, I've never peeled 100 weight of spuds, I've never gone down the naffy or anything like that, and probably for the sake of the nation, maybe that's a good thing. Or who knows, maybe not, maybe I'd have made a good soldier, we don't know. You just don't really know. Certainly there's a case for saying that ours are the best soldiery in the world. They're the longest and best trained. The world sends its officers, its would-be officers to Sandhurst. They're the highest paid army in the world. Its most ardent supporters will tell you they've never lost the war, unless you count the Americans. We have, of course, had plenty of practice in this. Palestine, Malaya, India, Korea, Kenya, Cyprus, Suez, Borneo, Vietnam, Aden, Oman, Dauphin, Northern Ireland, the Falklands, the Gulf, Bosnia, Kosovo, Sierra Leone, Iraq, Afghanistan. Those are just the first few I could find going back over the last few years, half a century. Even in the 1970s, when the received wisdom is that we were mainly interested in chopper bikes and Peter Lorimer, ballistic and delectable bottom, we managed a war with Iceland over our inalienable right to a fish and chip supper, the Cod War. Our national anthem. I'm aware that this chunk I'm reading, probably a bit too long now, but our national anthem. If you look at other countries' national anthem, Austria, mountains and rivers, these are the gist of the subject matter. Bhutan, that's the hymn of the thunder dragon. Lightning over the Tatras, I beg your pardon, Slovakia's national anthem. Sung to the old Hungarian folk tune, it is said they won't let me marry my ducky. That's really what it's called. Ours is essentially, oi, Prussia, you, outside in the car park now. That's what it boils down to. There's nothing about the Lake District, there's nothing about, our tea shops, it's all come on. That's basically it, our national anthem. So to return to the Somme, here's one way of getting just a flavour of the immensity of the horror of the Battle of the Somme, the first day. November 2009, Gordon Brown, the then Prime Minister, how long ago does that seem now, by the way, got into trouble. If you remember, a lady called Jane Jones, who'd lost a son in Afghanistan, she'd gone to the papers claiming that Gordon Brown had shown disrespect to her family because he'd handwritten a consolation note. Do you remember this? He'd handwritten it, and it wasn't terribly well written. And I always think that for some gentleman who lost an eye, it was rather hard of the press on him, but there was misspellings and corrections. And no mothers of those killed at the Somme got a handwritten note. Mainly because, had he been Prime Minister then, Gordon Brown would have had to write 19,240 letters within the first 2 hours of the battle. It is not conceivable by our modern standards of what we think of a war and its casualties, get to take in the Battle of the Somme. This is all in the book, and I don't want to bring us too much down. The German gunners actually had to take their hands off. They couldn't hold the guns. They were so hot from simply shooting for minute after minute after minute and hour after hour into men who walked very slowly and casually towards them to get killed as they were ordered by the officers. A couple from Gloucestershire called William and Julia Soules, Great Rissington, lost all 5 of their sons in one day at the Battle of the Somme. But now, let's lighten it a little with talk of the general strike. General strike. These days people are very squeamish about strike, I think. When I was a kid, again, strikes were just everyone on strike all the time. It was just a natural statement. First, bosses want one thing, workers want another. Sometimes you're not going to manage to sort it out over beer and sandwiches, or you'll have a strike. And then it gets sorted out. What's the point? Football match, it's a strike. We should have become terribly nervous about strikes, you know. I sometimes think sometimes Austria's days lost to strikes is 0. That to me is much more disturbing than having the odd strike, don't you think? Anyway, whatever you think, this chapter is about industrial relations. Many of you, well, I'll give you an example. In every job I've ever had, I've been on strike. I've been on strike as a... No, but I should point out, I'm not the common denominator here. I'm not some kind of agitator. I mean, when I job, I don't mean everything. When I was an altar boy, we didn't go out on strike. You know what I mean? When I was a teacher, I went out on strike. I've been on strike as a radio presenter about 2 weeks ago. Well, not on strike, wouldn't cross a picket line. And one of the jobs. When I worked in a cotton mill, I was on strike. Most hilariously of all, I went on strike when I was at the NME. Because I'm sure you all do remember the great NME strike of 1992, when the nation trembled on the lip of anarchy. Do you remember that? Ashen faces of the people on the TV news. But what will we do without our Ned's atomic dustbin features? Because I was about the only person at the NME at the time, I was about 25. I wasn't. I was older than that, wasn't I? Because I was the only person who had a proper job, though, before, loosely, having a proper job. I was the only one with any fully rounded notion of what a strike entailed. And the strike collapsed when, after about 2 days, they began to realise, the other NME journalists, that they couldn't go to New York with Primal Scream as they thought they were doing for a feature, because I said, IPC magazines aren't going to wear that. You are supposed to be on strike, you know. Yeah, but surely I'll still be all right to go, all expenses paid abroad with bands. I said, check it with the union, and I'm pretty sure it won't be coming off. And when they found out that no, IPC magazines and Reed publications run by Mr. M. Heseltine were not, off you go, lads, a joke's a joke. Of course you can have your all expenses paid holiday. No, that's when the strike pretty much collapsed overnight. Back in 1926, though, we apparently did nearly genuinely tremble on the lip of anarchy with a few days of the general strike. Trotsky and Stalin were both in Britain at the time. They came to Britain specifically because they thought, this is it, they're next. It's going to kick off here. The newly installed, remember, it's only 9 years after the Russian Revolution, genuine fear in Britain that this was going to be our revolution. The Russians actually sent us a load of money to support the striking workers, but it was sent back by a terrified trade union congress who weren't as kind of militant as many of their workers thought they should be. Churchill got involved. He was something like Minister for Biscuits at the time, but never letting that stop him. He jumped in. He sent a warship to Liverpool, I think. I think they sent a warship to Liverpool. He put police on the street, army on the streets of Newcastle. He jumped in. The slogan was, you know, not a penny off the pay, not an hour on the day, because miners leaders were trying to get miners to work harder for less money, a double whammy that very few people find attractive, to be honest. In Cramlington, in Northumberland, which I go to in the book, which is where Alan Shearer played his schoolboy football, which is where Ross Noble, the comedian, grew up, and I think which was where a young teacher, now the smackable lutenist Sting, did his teaching practice. I went to Cramlington. Cramlington's in my book, though, not for any of those reasons, but because they derailed the Flying Scotsman there. The striking miners put down stones and paving stones and cobblestones on the track and derailed the most famous locomotive in the world. Again, puts into perspective when you think that the good old days and how people have, you know, now we're all very violent and disruptive, and there was a kind of good old days. Derailing the Flying Scotsman, for which a lot of them were sent to jail for years, was quite a disruptive thing to do. And in my book, I talk about that. Anyway, chapter 4 is about the coming of television. So we can, right, we'll lighten up now. TV came to Britain in 1938, Alexandra Palace. I, like probably a lot of people in this room, I sort of grew up with telly, with Jerry and Sylvia Anderson and the aforementioned Rent-A-Ghost and stuff like that. My stock in trade now is writing books and being on the radio. That's what I like to do. I do pop up on telly, but if you're a writer and if you're a radio person, telly is an odd. It is so palaverous, for want of a better word. It's when I go on the radio tomorrow, I'll walk into that room, and I know what you're going to say. You're going to say, yeah, we can tell. And I'm going to walk into that room, and with a modicum of working out, we've planned all the shows in advance in terms of what records we're going to play. We'll open those mics and we'll start talking. That never happens on television anymore. If it ever did, I'm not sure. Every word you see on television has been script edited and focus grouped. Live television is such a rarity these days because there's a terror about it. That is the beauty of radio for me. There is still quite a lot of live radio. All day long on the BBC's networks, you get quite a lot of live radio. And sometimes that goes wrong if you're Jonathan Ross and Russell Grant, of course. But, it's an exciting medium. That would never happen in television. Let me give you a couple of examples of how palaverous television is. Well, we have a handful of people. There's me and Mark on our radio show, or there's me on my other radio shows I do my own, producer, SM, a couple of people. There's about 4 or 5 in the room, broadcasting to millions of people. Television, the first thing you notice is, who are all these people? And you'll notice there's a kind of person. There's a young runner called Jamie who keeps turning up with styrofoam cups of tea. There's a tall, willowy girl called Chloe with a clipboard and with an earpiece who you think has been transported into some reverie because she's always got a faraway look in her eyes. That's because someone in her ear is saying, can you get Eamon Holmes into makeup? It's so palaverous. There are layers and layers of people working on it, even the smallest of show. I was once doing a show. I apologise if you read the book. Some of these anecdotes are in the book. I was once doing a panel show. Mark Steele, the comedian, was on it as well. We got through, we'd done the dress rehearsal sort of thing, what's called a camera rehearsal, just so they know where the cameras are going to be. And, yeah, you couldn't have worked that out, could you? That was such an incredible technical term, the camera rehearsal. Sorry, I would have rather patronisingly explained the phrase. They said, blah, 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 Stuart Maconie, blah, 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 blah. And finally, from Radio 2's The Mark Steele Solution, Mark Steele. Mark said, that's great. Can I just, it's small point, but it's Radio 4's Mark Steele Solution. And the tall, willowy girl called Chloe went, I'm not sure what we can do now because the writers have gone home. Absolutely. That couldn't just be changed without someone going to the producer and someone going to the writers and can we change the script. Another example, I was once interviewing a film director about a film called Tonight, it doesn't matter, but it's called Tonight Let's All Make Love in London. It's a very rarely seen movie about psychedelia in Britain in the late 60s. So we interviewed him in Camden Market. Interview went okay. At the end, the director said to me, you're going to have to put a reference to the fact that we can hear the underground trains rumbling through from time to time, and it's very distracting. If you could put in a line about that at the end, great, okay. I thought, well, it's going to be a bit difficult. And so I ended up making some terrible, cack-handed line about, well, the influence of your film rumbles on, rather like the Northern Line trains that we've been hearing during this interview. Then they get it back to the editing suite, and you can't hear the trains. So now you just hear me saying this random, mental thing. So they go to the gramophone library of the BBC. Yes, you're ahead of me. And get the sound effects disc of underground trains and dub a few on. That's the kind of palaverous world of television. There's no play misty for me about TV presenters. Because I think the reason is, because however fanatical about TV or however deluded you might be, when you're looking at Eamon Holmes or Lorraine Kelly or whoever, I think they're in a studio, there's lots of people about. They're not talking just to me. But it took me a few years to realise that radio is a very, very intimate medium. And when you start to realise it, you go, aha, that explains some of the... Because people hearing my voice are hearing it in the car, in the bath, in bed, in a tent, in a remote Scottish valley, in a bedsit, in a garden. It's not like TV from that point of view. You are a rather insinuating and intimate voice in their ear. So I can completely understand why you start to... I do it myself. You start to come to feel you know and have a different relationship with a radio presenter than with a telly presenter, who you can kind of tell is in a brightly lit room waiting to go to the catering van, you know. So the advice, you know, and we try and encourage that intimacy in radio. Advice often given to young radio presenters is speak as if you were only speaking to one other person. I've worked on radio shows where that is all too easy to pretend. But the reason for that is, and I say this not to be kind of boastful because this is an old gig, Radio 2, an old time, when I used to sometimes sit in for Terry Wogan or Johnny Walker. Wogan's show got 9 million viewers. Johnny Walker's show, 5 million listeners, sorry. That, if you thought about that, if you thought as you came to the microphone and opened that fader, there are 85 Wembley stadiums full of people listening. Nothing would come out of your mouth at all except a kind of bat squeak of terror. That'd still be better than Talk Sport, but that's all you get. Remind me at the end, I'm just noticing that Ladies Guide Dog, remind me at the end to tell you my very funny radio story. If I should tell you now, is it right that if a guide dog hasn't got a harness, that it's off duty? Yeah, that it kind of is a bit more kind of playful and devil-may-care. No, I'll tell you why, because once when I went in to do a radio show in Broadcasting House, I made the mistake, someone said to me, go and talk to Peter White wants to see you. You know Peter White, the presenter? Peter White wants to see you. So I said, I'll go down to, I knew his office was. So I said, Peter, it's Stuart Maconie. And I opened the door, and Peter's dog, whose name I've forgotten, was there without his his or her harness on, and made a bolt for it. Bolted out of the door, ran straight into Woman's Hour. And this poor woman from Woman's Hour had just put, it was Friday, I remember this, because she had fish and chips from the canteen, and had put them down on the floor as she went to her desk, and it went, and it had these fish and chips. And I said, Peter, what's happening with the dog? He said, oh, well, you should have told me. He said, like, you know, no harness on. It's like, well, hey, anything goes, sort of thing. So there you go, that's a tip. Anyway, that's kind of connected with the chapter, isn't it? So that's the kind of difference. And I've only twice in my life I've felt, but TV it does cast a great influence, I know that. Twice in my life I've fallen into the television. When I was on Have I Got News For You? Because you hear the music and you think, oh, there's Ian Hislop and there's Paul Merton. Like the kid in Poltergeist, I've fallen into the television. And I did Celebrity Mastermind. When you sit in that leather chair, Celebrity Mastermind. It's like, and you hear that music. I actually felt like a band of steel tighten across my stomach. Because even though it was supposed to be Celebrity Mastermind, it's all for charity, I'd rather stupidly gone along thinking, oh, it'll all be very light-hearted and we'll do it in party hats. Got to the dressing room, bloke comes in, really serious bloke. Right, are you familiar with Mastermind? I said, like, yeah, of course I am. Everyone's familiar. And he was like, no joke. Right, can I just tell you a few things about the show? If you want a challenge, you must challenge immediately. Can I just warn you, though, we've never had a successful challenge in the history of Mastermind. And I said, well, it doesn't happen, though, because I've watched Mastermind, and they never stop. They never stop the show, though, and have a challenge. He said, like, we edit those bits out. And I thought, oh, yeah. But they have a challenge every series. There's never been a successful challenge, which is pretty much him saying, come and have a go if you think you're hard enough, wasn't it? I didn't have a challenge. I did 20th century British poetry. When I got there, the other people had done Star Wars, the band Nirvana, and I thought, no, you thought you were right smart ass doing 20th century poetry, didn't you? But anyway, I won, thanks for asking. But bloke from the Bill was very cross, he got very competitive, the bloke from the Bill. He did the Academy Awards. He said to me, I said, what are you doing? He said, I'm doing the Academy Awards. I said, oh, right, are you interested in that? He said, not really. I wanted to do the Beatles, but they wouldn't let me, because someone else has already done it. And I said, well, those are the only two subjects in the world, aren't they? It got really nasty after that. I thought it was quite funny. I won anyway. I'll just tell you this. This is an apropos of nothing moment, but I just like it. And it was a charity thing, so you had to say you wanted your money to go to. So I sent my money to Sightsavers, who are the people who work in the third world to, river blindness. And my mum rang me up 2 days later and said, "Were you on that Celebrity Mastermind the other night?" I said, "Yeah." She said, "Yeah, Doreen and the hairdresser was telling me about this. Did you win?" I said, "Yeah." She said, "Why did you give the money to Specsavers?" Your dad's just paid £125 for 2 pairs of glasses. Anyway. The 40s chapter is about 1948 and the Empire Windrush, the coming of the Empire Windrush. My publisher says that it's the warmest chapter in the book. I hope so, because it is unashamedly a chapter saying, we are a mongrel nation, and the coming of, in 48 of this country has, it might have been enriched Britain culturally, musically, etc., etc., etc. And if you don't agree with that, whether you're from Chorley or Lahore, get with the programme. It's unashamedly aimed towards, I think, the brilliance of a multicultural society at its best. If you like pop music, it's a given. I went to various places associated with immigrant communities in Britain. I went to Thetford. To tell you the truth, I stayed in King's Lynn just before I got, because I do. If I'm going to have to go around the country researching, I try and make it into a treat, so I try and find a nice place to stay. And I tweeted, "Where's a good place to eat in King's Lynn?" And the first reply I got said, "London." Right, okay. King's Lynn itself has got interesting things with about immigration, because King's Lynn has a lot of Dutch people and Dutch people's houses there, because the Hanseatic League, if you're familiar with the Hanseatic League, I like the early stuff best before they got the 2 girls in and made the Hanseatic. Oh, you see, sometimes I say that and people don't get it. You're smart cookies. The Hanseatic League were a kind of trading partnership between us and the Low Countries. At one point, we nearly merged as a country with Holland. I find this fascinating. I found this out when I was writing the book. We nearly merged as a country with Holland. We had our trading partnership, and it was so close, and Dutch engineers were coming in all the time with the fens and the dikes and everything, and we were going over there. There was seriously, should we just merge? Wouldn't it be easier? We nearly did merge two entirely separate countries separated by water. Didn't happen, but there's still a very strong Dutch presence there. And I went there because I wanted to go to Thetford. Oh, sorry, I got to tell you first that I did get a meal in King's Lynn. I went to this restaurant down by the River Ouse. It was a funny little establishment. And just as I was having my soup, or whatever, the restaurateur came over and went, "I see we have a celebrity in tonight." And I thought, well, I might get free sherry or something. And then I looked across, and at the next table was Phil Mitchell from EastEnders. Seriously. Restaurateur kind of nudging me. Phil Mitchell from EastEnders. Yeah, right, yeah. Didn't have a clue who I was. I did think, what are the chances of this on a Tuesday night in King's Lynn, Anyway, did you spot, by the way? It's been a long day, it's all right. I went to Thetford because a third of Thetford's population are Portuguese. They were encouraged to come in the 80s and 90s by big companies like Thermos and Dane Pack, and a third of Thetford's population are Portuguese. So you get Portuguese quarters of Thetford. Thetford, where they made Dad's Army, where there's a statue of Captain Mainwaring on the high street. It's, I think, rather brilliant that the day I went to Thetford, I sat for an afternoon, having very small potent glasses of brandy with a man from Oporto, watching Portuguese football and him telling me about his life back in Portugal, and eating those fantastic Portuguese egg custards, which, come on, Lancastrian egg custards, they're not the same as those Portuguese egg custards. They're serious. And I said, and I just thought, this is amazing. There's a Lithuanian community in Bells Hill in Glasgow. A third of New Malden in Surrey's population are Korean. So it goes on and on and on. And then I go to various places in this chapter, and I go to Handsworth as well. I'm a fell walker. I like the outdoors. I go fell walking. 1957. What time do we start? About 1:15. I'll try and move it along. When I started fell walking, I was a writer at the NME, so all my colleagues at the NME thought that I was certifiably insane. Because back then, I mean, it's image now, I think, because of Julia Bradbury and people. It's almost rock and roll now, walking. I don't know if it's just my age, but a lot of my mates in bands, Richard Hawley and Guy Garvey from Elbow. Nowadays, I'm surprised if somebody I meet, if I say, we used to go for a walk and they go, wow, I don't do that. Nowadays, I'm more surprised at that. Back then, when, you know, going and staying in the Wonder Stuff's transit van for a week was Steve Lamac's idea of a holiday. So, you know, what are you doing this week? I'm going to go to the Lake District and climb some mountains. Like, oh, man, what? It was literally what an anorak would do, in an anorak, you know. But I think that was part of what they appealed about it, because it was so different from the job I did. Oh, the reason I'm saying all this, of course, I should have said, is because the 1950s chapter is about 1953 and the climbing of Everest and concerns the British spirit for adventure. Because, of course, it was the British who conquered Everest in 1953. Those two men being one a Nepalese gentleman and one being from New Zealand. But hey, they were British as far as we're concerned. In fact, nobody British got to the top of Everest until 1975. But no, we gloss over that. 53, we got to the top of Everest. It was a British expedition. That mismatch, though, I began to quite enjoy the fact my mismatch between being an NME journalist who liked fell walking. It was nearly, although not quite as much of a mismatch, between the great W.A. Poacher, who some of you may know if you've ever been walking or climbed hills, the great mountaineering writer, W.A. Poacher, who wrote the definitive guides to some of the most difficult British rock climbs and mountain climbs, by day was the chief perfumier for Yardley's. Which I love that. I love the idea that, you know, ice clinging to his beard as he ascends an ape's needle in winter. This guy is also the same guy who puts those delicate top notes of lavender in your granny's lily of the valley that you buy her at Christmas. I love that. I still don't completely, I know I've embraced it completely. I think they could make a film about me called The Wickable Man. But I'm still not entirely, I don't think, fit in completely with some of the people who do go fell walking. I wonder if I should read, maybe, no, I was going to read you a big chunk of that bit, but I think, actually, to be honest, I think we should say that, because it is, I am aware that I'm only up to 1950s, and I better rush through till we get told. So, but if you want to read more about that, oh, and also that chapter is about one of the great levelling things in the outdoors. You get people like Chris Bonington and Don Willans, or you do get this match between, that on one level it's mountain climbing was invented by the aristocracy, but was embraced by the working class of the north of England as a hobby, and its traditions are as much in descent as anything else, certainly. And in the book I retrace the Kinder Scout trespass undertaken by Benny Rothman and a young communist from Manchester, who went up there as much to have a fight with some gamekeepers and policemen as they did to climb a hill. And I talk about the great traditions of outdoor activity in descent, and things like the Manchester Rambler by Ewan McCall. Chapter 50s, 60s. Football, for me now, is a kind of secret vice, because, and I bet this with a lot of people, I love football, I grew up loving football, I still love it, but I've started to dislike intensely the palaver and excess and ubiquity of football. I'm sure maybe other people feel like this. I still love football, but I feel it's something I should do furtively. I almost would rather say to people, no, I'm not interested in football, because everyone's got to say they're interested in football. And it swamps our national life, I think. You know, and it's become, I know it's a cliche to say it, but, you know, what was once a game so rooted in British working class life, for instance, now seems to become, you know, I mean, the Carlos Tevez saga, you know, makes you spur, doesn't it? And I do think that it has become an utterly secret vice for me. I still love it, but I'd rather people didn't know I did, because I take no pride in being a footballer. Having said that, though, I still get worked up about it. And so when, just at the end of last season, when Wigan Athletic, when that local boy made good, local hero, Hugo Rodallega, scored the goal that kept us in the Premiership, and also when Wigan Athletic first got into the Premier League, our first game, I don't know if you remember this, was against Chelsea. We nearly won. Herman Crespo scored in the last I think 93rd minute. And Ashley Cole was then at the height of his public vilification. He's kind of coming back into favour now slightly, Ashley Cole, isn't he? Sort of. But then, I mean, he was public enemy number one. He was public enemy for me because as someone who writes books, I was horrified by the fact that he'd been given a £500,000 advance for a shocking book that he wrote, full of bleating about the fact that he wasn't respected enough. And apparently, I remember the incident, he was running down the touchline and he kicked one of the Wigan Athletic players up into the air. And I remember being angry about it. And my friend said to me afterwards, you shouted at him, my books sold more than yours. Which, football players get all kinds of unseemly stick for all kinds of things. But I like to think that the haunted look on his face as he walked away. He was like, did that bloke say his book had sold more than that? This chapter is about football. It specifically centres around, I think, you could argue maybe the beginning of us losing marbles over football. The 1966 World Cup final, of whom the great hero was a dog called Pickles. I'll read you a little bit. If you don't know, Pickles was a little dog. Maybe this is self-explanatory. On a Sunday evening in the March of 1966, David Corbett left his ground floor flat in Norwood to make a telephone call from the kiosk across the street. This very act, of course, now seems pathetically, comically dated. It's like saying he nipped out to draw some water from the village well. He bled by leeches at the apothecary's hut. With him was his 4-year-old dog, Pickles. Almost immediately, something caught Pickles' attention. A tightly wrapped newspaper packet lying by the side of the road. I picked it up, said Corbett. I tore some paper. I saw a woman holding a dish above her head and the words Germany, Uruguay, Brazil. I thought, I found the World Cup. I rushed in and told my wife. She was one of those anti-sport wives. And I said, I found the World Cup because I tell you now, the World Cup had been stolen a week or so previously. In circumstances that, if you'll let me, I'll tell you that. Because it had been exhibited, it had been stolen where it was being exhibited at the Methodist Central Hall in Westminster, where it was being exhibited in a glass case as part of an exhibition of rare postage stamps. I don't get that bit either. Let's move on with the story. 5 guards normally kept watch. Sunday, though, so they'd given the guards the day off. Margaret Coombs, who was attending a Sunday school service at the time, said that she had seen the thief. He'd been loitering by the gents' toilets, she said. He was in his early 30s, of average height. He had thin lips, a scar, and greased back black hair, clearly suggesting he had come straight from central casting that morning. If you look at the footage of the day, of the news footage, you will see how things have changed since then. It's basically a lot of blokes in white raincoats with trilbies, pushing them back, smoking fags and going. The head of the CID says, could you give us a few moments to gather our somewhat scattered wits? It's, by today's standards, it's so unspun and honest. The fact that we've lost the World Cup. Well, come on, what should we do? What they did before those news items was they went to a silversmith's on Fenchurch Street and said, make us another one. We don't need to tell anybody. They asked for a replacement to make. News leaked out, though, and eventually the story became known. Because what happened? Oh, the thief, apparently, they said, had stolen by going around the back of the case and breaching the Hessian shield. A Hessian shield, that's a blanket, isn't it? So, anyway, a few days later, they get this odd letter. The FA get this very odd letter. Oh, I should say, of course, as well, people started to write in from all over the world saying they knew where the World Cup was. A man in Wicklow, one man wrote to Scotland Yard to say that his clock had told him, that's his clock, had told him that it was hidden in Wicklow in Ireland. Loads of people wrote in saying, oh, my next door neighbour's got the World Cup, just to get them into trouble. Perhaps someone would score about a long borrowed lawnmower or something, but, you know. They got a letter a few days later that said, Dear Joe, no doubt you view with... no doubt you view with very much... It's not that late, is it? No doubt you view with very much concern the loss of the World Cup. To me, is only so much scrap gold. If I don't hear from you by Friday, I'll assume it's one for the pot. I don't know what... Does anybody understand these phrases? Give me £15,000 by Friday, the cup will be back with you by Saturday. So this elaborate, we are running a little out of time, so I won't go into this in detail, but I will paraphrase and say this elaborate system is, there's meetings are arranged by taxi, the FA and the Chelsea chairman, they decide they're going to give him a pile of paper with 500 real notes at the top and the bottom, hoping that he won't notice this. He does notice, he panics, he runs off. It turns out he's a bloke called Edward Betchley, a 46-year-old ex-soldier, with a previous conviction in 1984 for that classic big-time caper, receiving tins of stolen corned beef. He says, I'm the middleman in all this. He says, I was only getting 500 quid. The mastermind is a man known only as the Pole. He then says, if you let my girlfriend stay with me in prison tonight, I'll tell you where the World Cup is. They think about this. They are considering this when Pickles finds the World Cup in the street. Pickles then, well, I'll tell you that, let's not beat around the bush. A year afterwards, in an absurd and horribly macabre accident, Pickles runs next door to chase a cat and hangs himself from his chain. A year afterwards. But what a year Pickles had. He was voted Dog of the Year. He was in a feature film called The Spy with the Cold Nose. He was on Magpie. He was on Blue Peter. He got a year's free supply of dog food from Spillers. They offered him tours of Chile, Czechoslovakia and Germany. He couldn't go because of the quarantine. He got himself an agent, same agent as Spike Milligan. He earned £60 a day. A lot of money in 1966. A lot more than his owner. In fact, more than the winning team at the World Cup, who were England, in case you didn't know. The 70s chapter, Silver Jubilee, punk rock. It's been gone over quite a lot, so it's just a chapter about the, you couldn't make it up, juxtaposition of that day in 1977 when one half of the country is singing one version of God Save the Queen and waving little flags and eating Victoria sponge at a trestle table, and the other half is singing a very different kind of God Save the Queen. I think the significance of God Save the Queen, of that day, is probably that I think it was the last occasion when the royal family were probably held in kind of a general consensus of approval. I think it was a punk rock movement were perhaps the first stirrings of not everyone agrees with this. Well, whether you agree or not, I think you might agree. And that's why it was such a furore in the newspapers. That's why the Pistols' actions were so... And again, you know, I tell the young people who couldn't see me now, you couldn't make punk rock up. I was in my mid-teens. These were not just people... These were people who were public enemy number one. These were people who, you know, politicians of every stripe were saying should be horsewhipped and locked up because of the things they did. When they appeared on Bill Grundy's show and swore, famously, a lorry driver from London kicked his television in. Because he was sitting watching it with his 9-year-old son, and he said it was setting a bad example to him. Yeah. Son, I don't want anyone setting a bad example to you. Why don't I kick this expensive and flammable piece of electrical equipment in? I just think you can't punk. It's just such a beautiful and significant moment in terms of the two Britons coming together, or rather not coming together. And I think it may be the beginning of a kind of slightly uppity, dissenting voice again in British culture. Although I would say, and I say this in the book, that in terms of the royal families, and you know, this is I take no stand in this, I'm just telling it roughly like it is, that this is always a pendulum that moves backwards and forwards according to events and according to whether there's a royal wedding or whatever. I personally think that if anything has contributed mainly to a certain lack of authority and respect for the royal family for a lot of ordinary Britons, it's not punk rock, it's not Diana's death, it's a celebrity royal knockout, if you remember that. Do you remember that? Go and look at it on YouTube. You won't believe it. You'll think you're having a malarial dream, honestly. You will not believe it. You would like, did this really happen? Emmeline Hughes, it's a list of the most extraordinary celebrities, sort of jumping over flaming cartwheels and stuff with minor members of the royal family. It is like a fever dream. And it was massive in America. The Americans absolutely loved it. I think because they just sat back and went, could you believe, all of these people, not just the royal people, but all of them, did we want something to do with this country? Whoa, that was a lucky escape, wasn't it? I think that's why, I think they look at it like it was a freak show, because it looks unbelievable. It was Princess Edward's first attempt after being in the Royal Marines to forge a new career. It was made by his television company. And, you know, you can't argue with that. He never was very convincing to me as a Royal Marine. I don't know about you. I don't know why. I never saw him with a dagger clutched between his teeth and his face boot-blacked, swimming across the Straits of Murmansk at midnight to single-handedly overpower a Russian gunship. But that's maybe just me. The 80s chapter is Live Aid. 80s 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 Live Aid. because all the music aside, and there's some very good music and there's some shocking music at Live Aid, as if you've watched it all, again, several times like I, you'll see. It's the birth of celebrity culture, I think, Live Aid. Before Live Aid, there had been celebrities. Eric and Ernie used to get 19 million viewers on a Christmas day. They were massive celebrities, but they were a different kind of celebrities, and the way we looked at them was different. Although they were huge celebrities, with audiences that today's performers can only dream of, the idea of saying to Eric and Ernie, Eric, Ernie, the starving children of the world need you. Can you get Dick Emery and Ronnie Corbett to help them? Everyone would have gone, what? But suddenly after Live Aid, that no longer seems ridiculous. Not only does it not seem ridiculous, it seems almost obligatory that we now think that to save the world, we don't look to politicians and we don't look to aid agencies. We look to Brangelina and Bono and Madonna. That starts at Live Aid, I think. For better or worse, that starts at Live Aid. Also, what changes at Live Aid, I think, is where a subject close to my heart, pop music and rock music, sit in the world's culture. Prior to Live Aid, it had still been a slightly outsider thing, I think. Festivals and the business of it, the Pistols, remember, it's only 7 years. When the Pistols happened, that's rock and roll being right out there. It's a disgusting thing. Find out whether your children are listening to this stuff, you know. 84, look at Live Aid, and suddenly completely in the mainstream. Prince Charles clapping asynchronously like a drunken seal to status quo. You know, the crowd at Live Aid, they looked like the crowd at Henman Hill at Wimbledon. Festival crowds weren't like that before Live Aid. They were girls in cheesecloth shirts, blokes in balaclavas selling you bad acid, Hells Angels, 13-year-old lads in Gentle Giant shirts with bum fluff. I knew I was that soldier. But, you know, Live Aid changes where pop music sits. It comes then right at the heart of our mainstream, which is where it remains today. So for two reasons, I think Live Aid is an incredibly significant bit of social history. Finally, 1997, if Live Aid is when pop stars became politicians, 97 is when politics changes, when a failed pop star becomes a politician. Anthony Linton, Charles Blair. Some of the points I want to make here, or make in the book, are not party political. They're simply, I'd like to think, sociological, the stuff I learned here, about the nature of politics. In that before Blair, if you see the generational gap between, say, Blair and John Major, you know, who in many ways, we now know, was much more of a dark horse than Tony Blair. Much, much more of a dark horse. But he didn't appear that way. John Major was Ovaltinis and having your granny combing your hair with, in your dressing gown with, borax on a Friday night in front of Billy Cotton's band show. Tony Blair is High Girls and Cheesecloth and the Grateful Dead and the Rolling Stones. My friend Mark Ellen was in the band The Ugly Rumours with Tony Blair, and said that he was completely, complete showman of wannabe Mick Jagger, and says being Prime Minister, he would become Prime Minister if he had his proper ambition, which was to become a pop star, but he couldn't, that didn't work out, so he thought, well, I'll become Prime Minister instead. Which gives you some clue as to the bloke's sheer force of personality, I think. Anyway, but I think that forever, it seems to have, in that, again, when I was a kid, politicians there were big fat ones, there were little tiny ones, there were ones with gigantic eyebrows, there were men, there were women, in fact, the fact that they were a bit of a freak show was what gave Mike Yarwood something to talk about every weekend. Edward Heath and Dennis Healy, never get those now. You would never get that now. Edward Heath, go sailing, plays the organ, not married, no way. Dennis Healy, those eyebrows, that voice, no way. Cyril Smith, have you seen him? No way. And that is why, and I think this is, whatever your politics, something to be worried about. That our political class has shrunken to a narrow band of individuals, expensively educated, all looking the same. Not the Stepford wives, maybe, the Guildford husbands. And you look from one to the other and you can't tell them apart in their politics or their appearance. And, and I think that is worrying. I think for a modern, diverse country, that's worrying. But anyway, off the soapbox, one last thing, two last things. I've forgotten my favourite anecdote in the book, so I'm going to tell it you, followed by my second favourite anecdote in the book. When I was at Wembley doing the Wembley chapter, I got invited to the Firefighter of the Year Awards dinner. I don't know why, I have no connection. you know, I yield to no man in my admiration for the fire service, but I have no connection with it. But I went because I thought it's nice to be asked. And also, part of me thought, it's at the new Wembley Stadium. I could have a mooch round for this chapter on the book. And I did. I managed to sneak away during, I think, during the moment when Bruce Forsyth was speaking at the dinner. And a nice bloke there, I told him what I was doing. He showed me around. He took me in the royal box. It was brilliant. At that dinner was Barry Cryer. Now, this story's got, if you've heard this story before, I apologise. This story's got nothing to do with the chapter on football. It's just, Barry Cryer, I said to Barry Cryer, you know, what have you been up to recently? He said, I did Just a Minute the other week. He said, I did it with Ross Noble. And in the green room beforehand, Nicholas Parsons, the presenter, had said to Ross Noble, who's your favourite comedian, Ross? Ross Noble said, well, let me think who I used to like when I was a kid. I guess I grew up, Richard Pryor. He said, why is that? He said, well, it's just an amazing story. His mother was a prostitute. His grandmother was a prostitute. Raised in poverty in a black ghetto in Los Angeles. Cocaine addict by the time he was 15. Crack cocaine addict when he got some money in his 20s. Famously nearly killed himself by trying to freebase cocaine in a Coca-Cola can and a Bunsen burner. Had a massive mental breakdown, ran down the street naked, was arrested by the police, by the LAPD on Sunset Boulevard, running down the street naked. Married 5 times, bankrupted 3 times. Still funny, still making this comedy that's from within himself somehow, and this incredible life he's had. Nicholas Parsons said, wow. And a bit later on, Barry Cryer saw Nicholas Parsons in another part of the green room talking to someone else, saying, have you heard about Richard Bryars? You can see now why I didn't want to leave you without that story. And to conclude, the architect of New Labour is often seen as being, well, you can argue about this. Was it Philip Gould? Was it, well, Peter Mandelson certainly had a lot to do with this. And when I used to present a show on Radio 5 Live called The Treatment, which was a sort of satirical show, and I got to know quite a lot of political journalists during that time and hang out with them at various functions. And I was at one night when Mandelson turned up, and he made a beeline for us because of the journalist I was with, who I think might be Kevin Maguire from The Mirror or Paddy Hennessy from The Express. But he came over and said, I've got a bone to pick with you. He said, you and your paper keep putting it around that I'm some kind of Svengali figure, some kind of Machiavellian prince of darkness, pulling strings behind the scenes of the Labour Party. He said, I'm just a Labour MP. I am just the MP for Hartlepool. I'm an activist. I'm a committed supporter of the Labour Party. What is all this about me being some kind of sinister backroom puppeteer who... And his phone went off. He said, excuse me. Yes? And he looked at us and he went, yes. And then he looked back at us and he said, this must be suppressed. And then came back to us and like, no, where was I? You know. There's more in the book than that, but I'll stop now, and I've rabbited on for too long. And thank you very much for coming. It's been really nice to come back here, and thank you ever so much for coming. And if you do want a book signed, I will sit here and oblige.